Hey everyone, it's Lauren here, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in to our YouTube page and watching one of our sermons on YouTube. The footage you're about to see is from a sermon that I did in the context of a Sunday worship service, and the part that you won't see in the clip following is the two movie clips I showed you and the discussion I had at the beginning of the sermon before those clips. So this is to provide a little bit of context before we drop you in to the footage from the Sunday worship service. On this Sunday, I preached on Oppenheimer, a movie about the work of Robert Oppenheimer and other scientists in the Manhattan Project on the creation of the atom bomb. In the course of this sermon, I follow the storyline of the movie and urge those in our congregations and others who watch this to continue to have good and hard conversations about the aftermath of the war on Japanese civilians and also the extent of the internment camps here on U.S. soil and dialogue after. My hope in showing a challenging film such as Oppenheimer and clips from it is that we can continue to believe that we can have hard conversations in the context of church and what we believe God is calling us to in the course of the realities of our everyday life, in a life of post-nuclear reality. The two clips that I chose to show for Oppenheimer were about his gradually increasing moral anxiety and dilemma as he discovers and begins to question the moral authority of dropping an atomic bomb. The first clip you'll see Niels Bohr, a nuclear physicist that had a lot to contribute to the scientific world regarding the structure of the atom. Niels Bohr urges Oppenheimer to think about the reality post-nuclear bomb that he, Robert Oppenheimer, has a responsibility to help shepherd leaders of the United States to realize what a post-nuclear reality looks like and how to advocate for peace after the making of the bomb. The second clip was Oppenheimer's run-in with Leo Szilard and another scientist when Szilard presents Oppenheimer with his petition that 70 other scientists sign, stating that the United States should give Japan the terms of surrender and give them the opportunity to surrender before American use of atomic weapons. This petition never made it to President Truman's desk and wasn't really known about in the context of the general public until 1961. If you would like to see those two clips, they'll be included in the information of the video below, and you can go ahead and hit pause and watch those clips now. I hope you enjoy the remainder of the sermon.
So you'll see two instances of rising pressure against Oppenheimer, cautioning him. And what plays out in the movie that is pretty clear is the warring that happens within Robert Oppenheimer about the creation and use of this technology he helped to create. At first, it seems like he's a master problem solver, which is what's needed in his role as leader on this project. But as the war progresses and the race to find the conclusion to the science continues, Oppenheimer seems unable to explore the unintended consequences of the bomb, especially after others repeatedly express caution and then advocate against their use, as we saw in the petition. But after the testing of the bomb, he seems haunted by the unintended consequences of his work and of his leadership. Oppenheimer and many of the scientists were Jews, and thus they were very concerned that Hitler's scientists might build a nuclear bomb first. After Germany's defeat, the American scientists continue feverishly to finish the bomb, and the target switches to Japan. The military, having suffered many casualties and seizures of occupied Pacific islands, believed at the time that the Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender, and that the civilian population was also being trained to fight invaders to death. Some debate these assumptions, though, in hindsight. Estimates of casualties of invasion varied, but they were all high. Several 100,000 Allied troops and millions of Japanese. Those in favor of dropping the bomb argued that far more lives would be saved by the bomb's use than would be during an invasion. I should note that whether the atomic bomb was necessary to bring about the war's end became one of the greatest controversies to come out of World War II. Supporters of the bombing generally believe that they saved more lives than they caused, but opponents contend, among many other moral arguments, that the bombings were unnecessary to win the war and constituted a war crime or even genocide. Whether the atomic bombings truly forced the Japanese to surrender and whether projected casualty rates for the Japanese invasion were accurate has become a controversial issue for historians to tackle. However, no matter what you believe about the use of bombs, what's clear in this film is Oppenheimer's deeply conflicted nature about its use, about its morality, and about his central role inside it all. His fascination with the science and the scope and scale of the project make it so that his questions about morality of their work come too late and too quietly. After the last clip I just showed you, Oppenheimer does in fact meet with the U.S. Secretary of War and other key scientists, and he brings up his moral fears to his credit. But he has his measure cautioned, and he quickly is squashed by other leading military voices. Too late, I feel Oppenheimer had a clear sense of guilt over what he and his colleagues had unleashed. Like Pandora's box, he knew that he could not close the box and go on as if nothing had happened. Oppenheimer himself describes it this way: in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatements can quite extinguish, he says, 2 years after the Trinity explosion, that's the test, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. When Oppenheimer eventually meets President Truman, he tells him that he feels like he has blood on his hands. And even at the end of the movie, we get a sense that he can never quite shake the consequences of his creation. The story of the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer's, as well as the work of other scientists, reminds me of the story of the Tower of Babel and the quest for human production. In both stories, people come together to literally build a city. They experience the capacity of human knowledge and imitate creative divine power, and then experience its unintended consequences. Hear the scripture lesson now from Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, there are one people, and they all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. This story in the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures is part of Israel's prehistory, meaning before God's covenant with Abraham. The story immediately follows the narrative of the great flood of Noah's Ark. And one of God's directive blessings at the end of that story was for humans to increase and multiply, to fill all the ends of the earth. So in this story, we see the humans doing the opposite of that. In this story, that blessing is at odds with the will of the people, which is to stay in one place, presumably for safety in numbers, and to have one culture with one common project, to have uniformity. They use their unity in defiance for God's will. Their desire to stay together and build a tower seems benign enough to our ears. But the need for the great height of the tower begins to sound a little fishy. It wasn't right, some theologians say, that humans should try to reach the realm of the divine and perhaps challenge God's very power in the process. The story leaves us assuming that the builders might want to enter heaven themselves or consider themselves gods because of their technological advances. Such towers were actually common in the ancient Near East, and they were made to look like mountains, like how you see the pyramids in Egyptian society. They were places of great religious significance in most religions of ancient times because divine activity was thought to happen in the heavens or at the level of the clouds. And in fact, in Babylon's alternative creation story, the gods were the ones that made the bricks, and such brick making was actually a great rite. And on the mountains or towers that were erected at the time, they had the names of the kings or rulers written on the actual bricks that made up these mountains in order to give the rulers a sense of eternal legacy. In this way, the builders of the Tower of Babel seek to build their own monument of their own self-defined identity. It might not surprise you that the common interpretation of this story is a cautionary tale of humankind thinking too highly of itself, or perhaps thinking too little of God. And when their ingenuity and teamwork reaches a point of unchecked defiance of God's blessing, God intervenes, comes down to perhaps their little tower, and assesses their half-built structure and calls it Babel, or literally meaningless gibberish. Humankind goes from having unlimited potential to existing within a world of limits. Apparently, God is uninterested in a people united for the purpose of assuring their own fame and safety. God instead prefers a world of faithful people of different languages, cultures, and ideas. God responds by mixing their language, which is actually a better translation than confusing their language. Something that isn't undone until Pentecost, when the Spirit allows for all people of diverse backgrounds to speak in one tongue, signaling a return to unity from a place of diversity. I think what's worth gleaning when putting the movie of Oppenheimer in conversation of the story of the Tower of Babel is the difference between knowledge and power and wisdom. In the story of the Tower of Babel, the people seek their own knowledge and power, and by doing so, doubt the wisdom of God's blessing to go out in the world. In Oppenheimer, he comes to doubt the wisdom of his creation. In both stories, there's a rush to experience human knowledge and creative power, both of which are not necessarily bad things in themselves, but do have unintended consequences. And in the case of Oppenheimer, he experiences gripping moral anxiety and spends the rest of his life trying to mitigate the very limits that his technology helped to create. Both stories are examples that sometimes the quest for knowledge and creative power can challenge our grasp of wisdom. In the story of Babel, the mistake of humanity isn't simply human obsession with creation, but it's avoiding God's directive blessing for diversity diversity of experience, diversity of thought. Instead of filling the ends of the earth and multiplying, humans limit their own knowledge by preferring uniformity of one collective experience. Similarly, Oppenheimer's leadership of driving others to the creation of the bomb, a skill he needed to do his work, backfires as he dismisses valid points of caution that he doesn't have the capacity to see when he is so focused on the goal set before him. Oppenheimer's quest in leading the effort to build the atomic bomb was to build something to end a war, perhaps to end all war. But the end of his scientific discovery, he likens himself to a line in the Hindu scriptures where he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." If there's anyone who must know what it's like to create something without complete control over it, it must be God. The difference between human creation, though, and God's, I believe, is the wisdom in it. Oftentimes, our ability to create has its own limitations, and we cannot perceive unintended consequences. But the thing that marks God's creation and what makes God able to call God's creation good is the wisdom in it. The wisdom of God is love and peace and shalom. We believe that God is always creating for the good, always addressing the brokenness of the world. Our God is not a destroyer of worlds, but a redeemer of worlds, even in post-nuclear technology. God does not abandon humankind when the world is not as we would long for it to be. But instead, God continues to be at work in it, even despite human interference sometimes. When Oppenheimer refused to sign the letter that Szilard and others wrote opposing the bomb on Japan, Oppenheimer said in the second clip that the scientists who invented the bomb have no greater rights or responsibilities than others about how to use this weapon. The end of the film, it's clear that Oppenheimer disagrees with himself. Maybe the story of Oppenheimer shows us that sometimes we can better seek peace because we are painfully aware of what war is. We are wise when we understand that brilliance exists in the world is always affected by brokenness in it as well. The scientists that tried to warn Oppenheimer about a world with nuclear weapons understood the new world that had been created, and they now understood the great responsibility they had to create a culture of peace, even after peace had more weapons against it. As people of God, we both know the dream of peace, wholeness, and justice, the shalom that God has for the world. And on the other hand, we know that the world exists with brokenness still in it. Even though you might not be a nuclear physicist, God has created in each of us something valuable to contribute to this world. Both of these stories teach us that things have unintended consequences when we devalue chasing the blessings of God. When we put aside differing opinions simply because they distract us from what we think we want, or when we don't think that we can discuss hard things. When we as humankind are faced with seemingly impossible choices within systems that aren't always set up to help us maintain moral integrity, God encourages us to follow the blessing of diversity of experience and thought. I should note, Presbyterians do not traditionally hold on to the theology of pacifism as part of what we believe. Historically, instead, we hold on to the tenets of just war theory, where one of the qualifications is that all wartime actions end in restoration and a path of wholeness. Ultimately, our call as Christians is to look to God, who is always at work in choices that center around human flourishing, the perpetual blessing of God, and to use whatever power we might have to help the world in that direction. I think that everyone would agree that peace is far harder to build than any bomb. That at times, peace feels more fragile than something explosive. Yet even for the most brilliant among us, we all long for a legacy of peace. May we remember today and all days that true wisdom lies when we chase God's blessings of true peace, flourishing, and shalom forever. Amen.
Now we invite you to get to know our community better. Go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel or check out our website at lopc.org. We hope that we have a chance to get to know you better and that you can find a home at LOPC.